The train screeched to a stop in the frozen dark of Wisconsin, winter 1944. Steam hissed against the cold, wrapping around the cars like breath from an exhausted beast. When the doors clattered open, dozens of Japanese soldiers stepped down onto the snow-packed ground. Their faces were hollow, skin gray with fatigue, uniforms torn and patched with thread or rags. They had been told this was where the end would come. That capture meant torture, humiliation, starvation. Every man who stepped from that train carried the same thought: better death than disgrace. But death didn't come. A sharp wind cut across the camp, carrying a strange smell: smoke, oil, and something else, something rich. Food. Real food. Through the drifting snow they saw rows of wooden barracks, guard towers, barbed wire, and a few armed sentries. The place was ordered, almost quiet. Not the dungeon of their nightmares. Trucks rolled past, engines humming. From the chimneys rose the smell of meat and bread. They hesitated, unsure if this was deception or mercy. Commands were shouted in English, fast and clipped. They understood little, but the tone was not cruel. Line up. Move forward. Red Cross officials stood nearby with clipboards, their presence impossible to reconcile with the image of the barbaric Americans painted by propaganda. One prisoner whispered, "Where are the beatings?" Another said nothing, afraid that any sound might break the spell. The intake began, delousing, burned uniforms, medical checks. A medic lifted a prisoner's bandaged arm and began to clean the wound. The man flinched, braced for pain, but the touch was careful, almost gentle. He stared, eyes wide, unable to understand. Was this how enemies treated captives? When night came, they were given wool blankets, hot water, and cots in heated barracks. The men lay down still dressed in fear, waiting for the cruelty they had been promised. But outside, the wind carried only the rhythm of the camp. Boots on gravel, engines fading, kitchen smoke rising through the snow. Somewhere in that silence, a thought began to form, one too dangerous to speak aloud. Perhaps the Americans would not kill them. Perhaps the real punishment would be learning how wrong they had been. By the winter of 1944, the Pacific War had turned against Japan. From the beaches of Saipan to the jungles of New Guinea, surrender had become the unthinkable word whispered by starving men. The Imperial Army had taught its soldiers that capture was worse than death, a stain that would follow their families forever. Surrender meant shame, humiliation, and stories of American cruelty passed from camp to camp. When transport orders came, the prisoners expected a final punishment. The journey itself had been a blur of fear and hunger. Crammed into freight cars with no heat, they crossed an ocean and half a continent, their rations dwindling to crusts of bread. The train windows were sealed, leaving them blind to where they were headed. Some prayed quietly. Others clenched their teeth and waited for the end. They had no idea they were being taken to Wisconsin, a land of white fields and silence, a world away from the jungles where they had fought. America was not starving. It was feeding its people and still finding room to feed its prisoners. The contrast hit hardest in the small things. Clean water, steady routines, warmth from a stove. These were luxuries to men who had eaten roots to survive. Inside Camp McCoy, the guards were young Americans barely older than the prisoners. They carried rifles but moved with a kind of casual discipline that didn't fit the image of sadistic tormentors. Some smoked while on duty. Others nodded at the prisoners as if they were factory workers instead of enemies. The Japanese soldiers didn't know what to make of it. Rumors ran through the barracks that this calm was a trick, that they would be used for experiments or paraded before cameras. Every unexpected kindness felt dangerous. Yet the evidence kept piling up. The rules were posted in multiple languages. Red Cross inspections came regularly. There was no shouting, no beatings, no hunger. That was the most disorienting part. After years of violence, they found themselves in a place that obeyed laws. A camp that followed procedures. It didn't feel like war, and that frightened them even more. Because if this was how the enemy treated captives, then what did it mean for everything they had been told about honor, loyalty, and the empire they'd fought for? Morning in Camp McCoy began with the clang of a metal bell. The air was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that bit through fabric. The prisoners rose from their bunks in silence, breath misting in the dim light. A guard opened the door, letting in the smell of coffee and something richer. Bacon, maybe. It drifted in like a memory from another world. They lined up outside, boots crunching on the frost. The guards called roll, their English clipped and even. No insults, no raised voices. Just routine. One of the older prisoners, a former sergeant from Okinawa, couldn't stop watching their faces. These Americans looked so ordinary, laughing quietly, wiping their noses against the cold. They didn't seem like monsters. That somehow made them harder to hate. Inside the mess hall, the prisoners shuffled forward with trays. Steam rose from metal pots, scrambled eggs, potatoes, and slices of bread thick with butter. The smell was almost unbearable. Many hadn't tasted real food in months. When one man hesitated, unsure if he was allowed to eat, a guard nodded toward him. "Go ahead," he said gently. "Eat." The prisoner stared at him for a long second, then lowered his head and took a bite. The first swallow burned his throat, fat and salt. He blinked hard, and for a moment his hands shook. Around him, others ate in silence, small, quick bites as if someone might take it away. A few wept quietly into their trays. Days passed like that, marked by the strange rhythm of decency. Work details clearing snow, inspections, letters censored but delivered. The guards gave them cigarettes. A few even tried to talk. Simple words, gestures, smiles. The prisoners didn't know how to respond. They'd been taught that showing emotion to the enemy was shameful, but it was hard to keep a wall between them when someone handed you a cup of hot coffee on a freezing morning. At night, they wrote in notebooks that would never leave the camp. "I am alive," one man scribbled, "but I do not know who I am serving now." In the dark, the sound of wind against the barracks roof was steady and calm. For the first time since the war began, there was peace, and it frightened them more than battle ever had. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day that felt too calm to belong to war. The sun had softened the snow, and the prisoners were lined up outside the mess hall, steam curling from the vents. Inside, the cooks were serving something new. The smell drifted through the air, grilled meat, onions, and something sweet. When the trays reached the Japanese men, they froze. On each plate sat a round bun, a slab of beef, and a bottle of Coca-Cola. They had seen these foods only in American magazines or captured supply crates. Now the enemy was feeding it to them. The guards laughed lightly at their hesitation. "Go on," one said, motioning with his hand. "It's lunch, not poison." The prisoners looked to their interpreter, who gave a slow nod. One of them lifted the strange sandwich and took a cautious bite. The taste was overwhelming: salt, fat, sugar, warmth. It filled his mouth and blurred his vision. Around him, others began to eat. The hiss of soda bottles being opened cut through the air, followed by the fizz of bubbles and quiet, unbelieving laughter. Some prisoners smiled for the first time since capture. Others couldn't eat at all. The contradiction was unbearable. The enemy, so often described as beasts, showing them a form of mercy their own leaders had denied. That night, the barracks were quieter than usual. Men sat on their bunks staring at their hands, as if unsure what to do with them. The sergeant from Okinawa whispered, "We were told they had no souls." No one answered. The warmth from the stoves felt heavy, almost guilty. In the following weeks, they began to change in small, invisible ways. They learned English words. They waved back when guards greeted them. Some wrote letters thanking the camp doctor who had treated their wounds. But kindness was a strange weapon. It did not bruise the body. It fractured belief. The empire had told them that mercy was weakness. Yet here, surrounded by barbed wire, mercy had become the hardest thing to bear. When lights went out, the camp settled into stillness. Outside, snow fell softly over the fences, blurring the line between captor and captive. Inside, the men lay awake, no longer certain who the real enemy had been. When orders for repatriation finally came, the camp filled with uneasy silence. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. The men who had once dreamed of dying for the emperor were now being sent home as prisoners who had lived. The word itself, survivor, felt like a wound. They lined up one last time in the yard, the same place they had once stood trembling with fear. The snow had melted now, leaving wet patches of earth and the smell of grass. American guards handed back their belongings, worn photographs, prayer beads, a few crumpled letters that had followed them across oceans. The guards shook their hands, some even smiled. One soldier pressed a small gift into a prisoner's palm, a bottle of Coca-Cola wrapped in brown paper. "For the trip," he said simply. The prisoner bowed, unable to speak. The trucks rolled out at dawn. Through the wire fence, the prisoners caught their final glimpse of the camp. The towers, the flag, the smoke curling from the mess hall chimney. No one cheered. They only watched in silence as the distance grew. Each man carried with him two images of America. One from propaganda, filled with monsters, and one from memory, filled with warmth and confusion. When they arrived in Japan, they found ruins where their cities had stood. Families broken, streets silent. The shame of surrender clung heavier than the dust of the bombings. Former soldiers avoided each other's eyes. No one spoke of the camps. No one wanted to hear about American kindness. That kind of truth didn't fit into the story Japan needed to tell itself. Years later, one of them would open a small diner in Tokyo. He'd hang an old U.S. Army spoon on the wall, dented, polished smooth by use. When customers asked where it came from, he'd only smile and say, "From a place where the enemy fed me." Then he'd fall silent, lost in the memory of snow, smoke, and a meal that changed everything. Some wars end with victory or surrender. Others end with a taste that never leaves. Sweet, foreign, and impossible to forget. Decades later, Camp McCoy was just another line in a government record. A neat entry in an archive that few ever opened. The barracks were torn down, the fences removed, and the fields turned back to grass. But for the men who had lived behind that wire, the memory never dissolved. It followed them quietly, through marriages, jobs, and the uneasy peace that replaced the war. In post-war Japan, they were ghosts of a different kind. Some never spoke of their captivity. Others told fragments. A clean bed, a doctor's steady hands, the first taste of bread. Their children grew up hearing two versions of the same war. One taught in schools, full of honor and sacrifice, and another whispered after dark, filled with doubt and strange mercy. Historians would later describe Camp McCoy and other POW sites as proof of America's adherence to the Geneva Convention, examples of fairness in wartime conduct. But the truth, for those who lived it, was far more personal. They didn't remember the politics. They remembered the warmth of food on a frozen day, the guard who offered a cigarette, the silence that came when hatred no longer made sense. One former prisoner returned to Wisconsin in the 1970s. The camp was gone, only an open field remained. He stood where the gate once was, the wind lifting his coat, the air sharp with autumn. From his pocket, he pulled a faded photo. A group of men in identical coats, smiling awkwardly at the camera. Americans and Japanese side by side. He stared at it for a long time, then slipped it back into his wallet. "We were enemies," he said quietly, "but they taught me how to be human again." War ends in treaties and trials, but its real legacy hides in moments like that, where kindness leaves a deeper scar than violence. Long after the weapons are gone, what remains is the unsettling truth that compassion can disarm more completely than any army. And somewhere in the silence of that Wisconsin field, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The faint hiss of a Coca-Cola bottle opening, and the sound of history breathing out.